The study of our own history is really important. The study of Australia is the study of who we are. It's a study of all of the aspects of who we are, not just the bits we want it to be. It's an exercise in telling the truth about our history, and it's a history that traditionally has been a bit mysterious. For a whole stack of reasons that we go into in higher grades, Australian history has been sort of a history where we've left things out that are unpalatable, a bit uncomfortable to us. So very much modern studying of Australian history says, let's tell a story of who we are, who we all are. So in this icon here, I've used the colours of purple and gold, often representing women. Let's tell the truth about Australian history, leaving nothing out, and I've used our traditional colours of green and gold here. I've said, let's not keep Australian history a mystery, and using the colours of both the Eureka flag and the Australian flag, the blue and white. And I've set all of that against an icon of the Australian continent in the colours of the Indigenous flag. And in there, because we're focusing on this period of 1788 to 1901, a very, very famous image of a family, a settler family, on the frontiers of Australia by Tom Roberts. So that's the icon there. So let's now explain the backdrop to Australian history. And there it is. This map's sometimes called the Tyndale map. And it's a map of Indigenous Australia. It shows, as much as we can see, or as much as we know to be accurate, all of the different Indigenous territories that existed in Australia at the time of European settlement. Now let's get our head around that. Australia was settled by Europeans in 1788 with the arrival of the First Fleet. Captain Arthur Phillip, his group of guards and convicts arrived at what he called Port Jackson and we now call Sydney Harbour, and created the first European settlement. Over the ensuing couple of hundred years, Australia has changed dramatically from this system of Indigenous occupation that existed for about 40,000 years. One of the big tragedies in Australian history, one of those historical issues that haunts us as a nation, is almost a denial of this process of occupation. And it's something that's been studied a lot. I can very quickly grab you books like this one, Henry Reynolds' famous Other Side of the Frontier. I can dig out histories like this one by Libby Connors. Another historian is talking about Dundalli, a resistance fighter of Indigenous who fought back against European settlement. He was arrested in the valley and he was hung in Queen Street outside our GPO. This is one of the resistance fighters. I can drag out more and more. I can drag out this one by Mark Copland, A History of the Fighting that's happening in Western Queensland. I can look at other books by Timothy Bolton that look at the struggle in Northern Queensland. And this goes on and on and on across all of Australia. So this issue of Australia's settlement by European is often caught up in the language also of invasion and resistance. The process of colonising Australia by the British was based upon a legal fiction called terra nullius. The British settled in Australia on a legal understanding that no one occupied this land. It was land for the taking. And this is a fiction. So we in Australia have struggled for a couple of hundred years of how we engage with our Indigenous history. So let's learn quickly a little bit about that before we go on our big journey of Australian history in the 18th century. Firstly, as we look at our map, the Tyndale map, we need to think there are two distinct cultural groups that make up Indigenous Australia. We need to know there's the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, ATSI. These groups across Australia spoke approximately 250 different languages, and those languages roughly aligned with 250 nation groups. Now, within some of those nation groups, there were multiple languages, so it doesn't quite fit, and that happens in the modern world today. Some nations have multiple languages spoken in them. Each of those nation groups had their own sets of alliances. They had their own subgroups, their own clans, their own relationships, trade routes, and so on, connecting them to other national groups. With these 250 nations, there were approximately, at the lowest count, about 300,000 first Australians, first peoples across our continent. Other archaeologists will go as high as 750,000 people across the continent. Where did most of them live? Well, you get a little bit of a sense of the spread, the density of the population by the size of the territories involved. So in these central areas of Australia where there's not much water, not much in the way of food supplies, the areas in which Indigenous groups operate are quite spread out. They're large areas. You need to be able to travel over large areas to sustain life. But in areas where food is plentiful, where water supplies are plentiful, where it's more hospitable, there are many national groups operating in small areas. And this would indicate they're very permanent settlements in some of those places. Present-day Queensland was the most densely populated part of Australia before 1788, and most of the fighting which takes place in our frontier between Indigenous and the settlers, the Europeans arriving, actually happens in Queensland. It happens all over Australia, but some of the most intense fighting happens in Queensland. The further north, often, the more aggressive those wars were. Now, this Indigenous history, these populations, were actually built around a huge range of different settlement patterns. We have our sense of Indigenous people all being nomadic, hunter-gatherers and so on. Well, that would be true of some, but there were also some permanent settlements. There's a lot of evidence of village life. In the areas where the population was greater, there was less movement. There was less travelling from place to place. Settlements exist. We've got weirs like dams and fish traps and villages existing all over our continent. The archaeological record's pretty strong. When I'm saying fish traps, I'm referring to aquaculture, fishing. There were groups settling on who based their whole economy and life on seal hunting, wearing furs, permanent villages and so on. So bear these things in mind as we study Australian history in the next few weeks. A lot of this at times feels a bit of a mystery, and what we need to do is talk about this aspect of our history, always have it in our mind as we address the issues that come up. One of the big processes happening in Australian history now is a process of telling the truth about a past that we have largely left out. And I would argue this is an important part of history as social justice. It's part of who we are as a school and our mercy ethos of caring for others. We need to also recognise that many Indigenous people are living alongside us. They go to our school, they're in our classes, they're our teachers, they're our friends, they're family members. It could be you watching this video. So when we're looking at this aspect of history, and at times the painful aspects of Australian history, we need to remember that the past isn't actually over, it lives on. The past isn't over, it's not even past, it's very much part of the present.